All right, at the University of New Haven, Associate Professor of National Security and Political Science is Matthew Schmidt. And welcome, Matthew.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Dana.
It's a great pleasure to talk to you because you're also a strategic analyst in foreign affairs, U.S. politics, security, military matters, and you've taught strategic and operational planning at the Army's Command and General Staff College. And I mean, that's certainly worthy of a mention. So it's great to have you. Can I kick it off very quickly asking you, what is your take on the attack in Russia on the Crocus City Music Hall? Is there any doubt in your mind that this was ISIS-K?
No, the great open source intelligence group Bellingcat, their actually Russian affiliate, went out of their way pretty much immediately after the attack and found a series of photographs of the four suspected assailants in Crocus City with other publications from ISIS-K earlier, and essentially has, in my mind, has identified them as longstanding operatives of ISIS-K. So that's where I'm at. I think it's ISIS-K. Absolutely. I do not think it's connected to Ukraine, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
Here's a front page article, for example, in Moscow's Argument and Facts, as it calls itself. A little loose on the facts, but so, quote, "We know the architects of Crocus attacks and who organized it. Let them burn in hell. All of them about it. All of this about Islamic State is rubbish. Let them tell this to each other." And who they were referring to as each other is in a front page article where they put up pictures of President Biden, Ukrainian President Zelensky, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of Britain, and the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. What is going on there? Because this media, as you well know, is state managed. So that's a direct marching order from the Kremlin to tie this to Ukraine anyway, anyhow.
I got to say, I'm old enough to remember when Argumenti Fakti was in fact an independent newspaper and did good reporting. So it kind of breaks my heart every time I see these outlets now under the thumb of the Kremlin. This is what Putin's doing, right? He is reaching out and he's going to take advantage of the situation. It's important to remember that he took, I don't know, 12 hours to respond, 12 hours before he came out. He did it by a canned video. He didn't make himself available for questions. And this is what happens when you have when you lack a free and independent press, right? Nobody's verifying these things, and you have a country that, I mean, they tortured these guys, right? If they in fact did this, indeed, let them burn in hell. But you and I live in democracies that at least have a pretense towards, guilty until proven innocent. And when you look at what Argumenti Fakti is saying here, they're not even saying like suspected assailants or accused. They're just flat out saying these guys did it on the basis of no due process. And that's exactly what Putin wants. He wants to amp up this rhetoric.
What do you make of that? I mean, Russia's a brutal society, and the security services certainly are generally, they don't have to account for anything that they do with anybody in their custody. But it is unusual for them to put out those videos. I mean, of them beating these guys, of electrocuting these guys, of cutting off the ear of one of them who later appeared in the courtroom with the ear bandaged. I mean, that was done for a reason and for effect, it seems to me.
Oh, yeah. That was, I mean, again, those things were filmed by the security services, by uniformed officers, and then leaked. Right? There was no pretense even that this was somehow not supposed to be leaked. It was just put out there immediately. And, it's out there to drive up war fever. And then, were reports early on that there were anonymous sources coming out of the security services that were saying that internally the professionals in those services had quickly ruled out Ukraine. That is, they accepted the basic logic that ISIS-K did this. ISIS-K had plenty of reasons for doing this. They had attacked the Russian embassy last fall in Kabul. Russia was supporting the Taliban, which are the arch enemies of ISIS-K, et cetera, right? that was an anonymous report. It was floating around in my channels. And I thought to myself, gosh, like, how is Putin going to handle this? I thought, well, the FSB is saying this. That's pretty unusual. And then it just died. And Putin comes out and gives a speech and doubles and triples down on this is really Ukraine. And then, you know, the images come out of these guys being tortured. And no one is saying anything negatively about this. No one in the press in Russia is saying, look, guilty or innocent, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be treating people this way. And that's, I mean, Dana, that's the difference between Russia and Ukraine. That's the difference in what people are fighting for, really. And I think we don't say that often enough.
Fair point. But at the same time, I tend to think that the Russians were furious that their president, some of them were furious that their president didn't take a warning from the West seriously and discounted it in an appearance before the FSB a couple of weeks before, saying it was a provocation and designed to disrupt the elections, essentially. And then they would be furious with the fact that the FSB and the security services allowed this terror attack to happen. So suddenly, you know, they got their men and they beat them senseless, probably with applause from a lot of Russians.
Oh, I'm sure that's true, but I disagree with you.
Please.
I don't think, if I may, not that you would ever stop a professor from disagreeing, even if you didn't, may. I do not think that most Russians are blaming the Kremlin. I think that Putin engaged in a very classic response, and for most Russians, they have been imbibing this idea that the West is against them, that, you know, Moscow is full of spies trying to subvert the world historical order of Russia. And so I don't think that actually hit very hard. And one of the things I always like to tell people is that you should read Russian fairy tales. This is a classic of Russian fairy tales where essentially bad things are happening and the Tsar isn't doing anything about it. And so the good, real Russians, right, like the real Americans, real Brits somewhere out there in the heartlands of these places, right, are beseeching the Tsar, come and do something right. And the Tsar finally hears about it, right, finally learns from honorable advisors what's really going on, instead of all the dishonorable advisors who are telling him lies to cover their rears on this, right? And this is classic of what Putin has done. He's saying, it's not me. It's not me. It's other people in the system. If there's a mistake that's going on, it's the defense ministry, it's the security services, right? And somebody's head will roll there. But once it gets to me, I, the Tsar, do the right thing. And that's the game he's playing right here.
Although he didn't criticize anybody in this case.
Not yet. Not yet.
He's been completely, not yet. He's been completely supportive of the FSB. I mean, he certainly hasn't called them out and hasn't said anything about his own security apparatus.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you heard reports. I think they're true, but they are unverified as far as I know, that it took an hour for security services to arrive on the scene. But these have all been vague, because in Russian, when you say security services, does that mean like the special troops that show up for these things, or does it mean ambulances and police? And the distinction between these things, which is important to ordinary Russians, isn't clear to me as a Westerner, where I'm thinking this means the police and, you know, and medical personnel.
I was at Beslan, the hostage taking of school children in Russia, and where 300 of them died. And I can tell you, you know, that by the time the special anti-terror units got to the scene and got organized and got even more disorganized than they were in the first place, you know, there were already flames pouring out of the building and dozens and dozens of kids dead. So you know, the idea that they raced to the scene in record time, I've never seen that happen in Russia. But anyway, that's kind of a right-hand turn. Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, said on Tuesday that, you know, he believed Ukraine, along with the United States and Britain, were involved in the attack on the concert hall, dismissed as nonsense by Britain and others. But I mean, this has kind of gone from a hint that from Putin that they were heading for the Ukrainian border. But I mean, these are pretty direct allegations now, which tends to make me wonder. They are going to have to, I hate to use the word respond because they're not they should be responding to the Islamic State, but they are going to hit Ukraine and possibly Western interests pretty hard.
Yeah. Back to what I was saying earlier, this idea that somehow some professional cadres inside the security services said internally, "Hey, this isn't Ukraine, right? This is ISIS-K." That fits with me with the story that Bortnikov waits, right? Doesn't say that publicly, and then reads the political winds and comes out and says what he says. And so now Putin still hasn't come out as hard as Bortnikov or Medvedev or these others, right? So he's letting his surrogates lead the charge on this. But you're right. I mean, now he has to hit hard. So what's he doing? He's obliterating Kharkiv right now. It's terrible, right? He's hit Kyiv again, and he has to do that. But the military side is really interesting, and I think it's not at all clear what Russia can do yet.
Okay, well, let's talk about the fact that Belarus, the leader, President Lukashenko, Putin's longtime close ally, has come out today and said that, in fact, the terrorists were heading for Belarus, but when he strengthened the border, they turned away, and maybe they were heading for Ukraine after that. But he went much further, talking about, maybe Russia and maybe Belarus may assist them in going after the Baltics and making a land grab, the Suwalki Gap, leading through Lithuania to Kaliningrad. Is this nonsense, or in the wake of the terror attack, does it get a little more traction?
So 20 years ago, almost probably to the day, I wrote a piece in an obscure journal asking if Putin was pursuing a policy of what was called Eurasianism. Then, what today we talk about is like the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, right? That some listeners might know this term. All of which is to say, like inside academic baseball here, I am not a believer in the realist theory of this war. I do not believe that this war was started because Putin felt like NATO was a threat if NATO came into Ukraine, because it was already in Estonia and the missiles would hit at the same time from Estonia as they would from anywhere in Ukraine. And so I think that this war is fundamentally ideological, and thus is not to be deterred easily by sort of the classic realist way of stacking up our guns against their guns and saying we have more or better guns, so stop. That said, Putin isn't stupid. He is not irrational, which is often what people say about world leaders who they don't like. He's hideous. He's an autocrat. He's all of these things, but he follows a logic. It's his logic, and it makes sense to him. The trick is to decode that logic.
Please, if you can help me, I lived in Russia for 12 years, and I've covered Putin since he came to power.
And here we go. Putin believes, or has come to believe, in a theory called Eurasianism, or the Russian world. And this comes from a guy by the name of Alexander Dugin. If you remember, his daughter was assassinated and he was seen as probably being the main target. He wrote a textbook in the 90s called The Fundamentals of Geopolitics, which was this horrible mishmash of stealing things from Carl Schmidt and the Nazis and the Slavophiles in the 19th century and all this kind of stuff. And it basically says that Russia is unique in world history. It's neither European, it's not democratic, right? It doesn't believe in a pluralist society. It doesn't believe in things like gay rights. If you look at Masha Gessen's work, The New Yorker, she wrote a brilliant book on this, about the role that anti-gay rights played in Putin's formation and his ideology. It's not Asian, right? It's not a kind of Asian despotism. It's something unique, and it's religious. Right, so Putin converts in the early 2000s, and he imbibes the idea of Russian Orthodoxy, and this idea that Russia has to survive as a culture, which of course means it has to survive as a country, but it has to survive as a culture in order to impart its ideas of what it means to be human in the future history of the world, right? And so now you have this theory of Russian culture is under attack and it might be obliterated. And that's what this is really about, because the one place that has to be
not a theory, but a propaganda that is spun by Putin and the Kremlin.
It's propaganda that's spun by him. It's an ideology. It's a system of belief, right? And the one place that is essential to this is Ukraine. So it's not Poland. He doesn't see Poland as part of this worldview. Poland's Western. He doesn't see Estonia as part of it. It's Ukraine, right? So on the one hand, ideologically, that's why he's not going to invade Estonia or Poland or Lithuania, right? It doesn't make sense. On the other hand, what comes out of this worldview is, without Russia's military might, both nuclear and conventional, Russia's just a large European state. It's not a superpower. There's no pretense to it. And Putin's not dumb. So what he's learned from the war is this sort of backwards ragtag army that started in Ukraine has done pretty damn well, right? And has degraded his military capacity an extraordinary amount. Even if Ukraine is in a bad position right now, Russia has lost more than it ever expected in terms of its combat effectiveness. So if he creates a situation to go up against NATO, he's done. He loses that military capacity, and he loses the central place that Russia holds in world history, because he no longer has any power. He's just like everybody else. And so that's why I think that he's not likely to do those things. And those are psychological operations that are aimed towards Western publics to force us to not allow our political leaders to give aid to Ukraine, more than they are serious military proposals.
I was going to ask you, I mean, some of this is designed to make the West and Ukraine come to the negotiating table and accept the annexation of the 4 regions that he's taken in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we're headed. Just 5 minutes before I logged on to talk to you, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has come out publicly and said he's trying to find a way to fund Ukraine. Right? Extraordinary news coming out of here right now. We'll see what happens. I'm not convinced he's going to be able to do it. But in any case, right, Ukraine's been in a bad position all winter and into the spring here. And it's a position where Russia, especially now, if using the excuse about Crocus City, they can manage to pull together some kind of offensive. They can take back Kharkiv and that area that the Ukrainians took back in 2022. Then he's in a position to sort of force negotiations. Again, I'm not sure the Ukrainians will do it, but I think they're closer to it than they've ever been.
I could talk to you for hours, and I know we don't have hours. So I mean, Kharkiv today, you have missiles slamming into apartment buildings. It looks like, the beginning of the bulldozing from the air of a major center in Ukraine, and it's going to be very tragic. But just to sum up all of this, we've talked about how you perceive President Putin and what his long-term objectives are, but all the rhetoric this week in the wake of this terror attack, and there's been some stunning stuff on Russian television, I mean, against the West and from the usual suspects, the Kremlin propagandists. But what is he preparing the Russian public for, do you think? Is he just, shoring up his support for the war continuing and the war and the support for him and his ability to keep a stranglehold on the power in Russia? Or do you think he's about to launch into, he's got his election, he's got his other 6 years. Do you think he's preparing something now, whether that be big mobilization or something else like that?
I think he's coming out and he's calling a war, which he hasn't been doing, right? He is moving from hiding the war from the major Russian public, from the majority of the Russian public, by recruiting in the far off areas of Siberia. And I think he's gonna start recruiting more heavily in St. Petersburg and Moscow regions in the northwest, where the population center is. And he's able to do that because he's gonna raise the flag and say, if you love your country, come get the people who supported the terrorists that blew up the music hall. And his first move is Russia needs artillery shells too. It needs equipment. It's facing an equipment and ammo bottleneck in 2025. So there's pressure on it to do what it can this year before it faces that bottleneck. And it needs people, just as bad as Ukraine does. And so he can't do a lot until he gets those things. And to some degree, simply getting the men, throwing them in uniform and massing them on the borders like he did in 22 before the invasion is a way to put pressure on the regime, the government in Kyiv and Western publics to put pressure on the government in Kyiv to force some kind of end state.
Matthew Schmidt, the associate professor at University of New Haven. I wish I was one of your students and could sit in some of your lectures, because you've got, you know, a lot of insight. And thank you so much for sharing some of that. It's really tremendous.
It's been such a pleasure. I'd love to come back.
Deal. Thank you, Matthew.